At 73, I never thought I'd be the one deciding whether my father lives or dies in dignity. But here I am, holding his medical bills in one hand and his empty bank statements in the other, while that woman who destroyed our family 35 years ago has vanished with every penny he had left. If this story sounds familiar to anyone out there dealing with family betrayal, please hit that subscribe button. What I'm about to tell you might just save your own family from the same heartbreak we endured. My name is Margaret, and I need to take you back to 1987. I was 39 then, with 3 teenagers and a husband who worked double shifts at the Ford plant just to keep food on our table. We lived in a small ranch house on Maple Street in Dearborn. You know the kind, where you could hear your neighbour's television through the thin walls and everyone knew everyone else's business. Daddy was 62 that summer, still handsome in that weathered way that comes from 40 years of construction work. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil and sawdust, and he smelled like Old Spice cologne mixed with honest sweat. Mama had passed 3 years earlier from the cancer, and we'd all been worried about him living alone in that big house on Elm Street. If you're enjoying this story so far, please give it a like. It helps other families going through similar situations find these stories. The house where I grew up had this big front porch with white wooden columns that Daddy painted every other spring. Mama's rose bushes still bloomed along the fence, though they were getting wild without her careful tending. Inside, everything stayed exactly the way she'd left it. Her good china still in the hutch, her reading glasses still on the kitchen table next to her Bible. Daddy would come over for Sunday dinner every week, always bringing a bag of those peppermint candies he kept in his truck. He'd sit in the same chair at our kitchen table, making jokes with my boys about their baseball games and asking my daughter about her secretarial classes at the community college. He was lonely, sure, but he was our daddy, and we thought we were enough. That all changed the day he walked into Murphy's Diner on Michigan Avenue and saw her. Charlene Morrison was her name, though she went by Charlie. 38 years old, bottle blonde with too much makeup, and a laugh that carried across 3 tables. She'd moved up from somewhere down south, Kentucky or Tennessee, I never did get the story straight, after her second divorce. She was working as a waitress at Murphy's, taking the evening shift that started at 4 o'clock. The first time Daddy mentioned her, it was innocent enough. "Met a real nice lady at Murphy's," he said, cutting into the pot roast I'd made specially for him. "Makes the best coffee I've had since your mother passed." My husband Frank looked up from his mashed potatoes and raised an eyebrow, but I just smiled and asked if she was new in town. Daddy's face lit up like a Christmas tree as he told us about how she'd grown up on a farm, how she knew about engines and could change her own oil, how she laughed at his old construction stories that we'd all heard a million times. Within a month, Daddy was eating at Murphy's Diner 4 nights a week. He'd shower and put on his good shirt, the blue one Mama had bought him for church, and drive his pickup truck downtown just to sit at table 6 and order coffee and pie while Charlie worked her shift. I started noticing changes in him. He bought new clothes from Sears, including a leather jacket that cost more than our grocery budget for 2 weeks. He got his hair cut at the fancy barber shop downtown, instead of letting old Pete do it for $5 like he had for 20 years. He even bought cologne, not Old Spice, but something called Brute that came in a green bottle and smelled like he was trying too hard. "She makes me feel young again, Maggie," he told me one Sunday, using the childhood nickname he hadn't called me in years. "When I'm with Charlie, I forget about these old bones and this tired heart." Frank tried to warn him in that gentle way he had. "Tom," he said, using Daddy's first name like they were equals instead of father-in-law and son-in-law, "just be careful. Sometimes when we're grieving, we make decisions we might regret later." But Daddy wasn't hearing any of it. His eyes had that shine they used to get when he talked about buying a new truck or planning a fishing trip. He was 62 years old and acting like a teenager with his first crush. The relationship moved fast, too fast for a man who'd been married to the same woman for 37 years. By October, Charlie was spending nights at the house on Elm Street. By Thanksgiving, she'd moved in completely, bringing 2 suitcases and a mangy orange cat that sprayed on Mama's good furniture. I tried to visit like I always had, but everything felt wrong. Charlie had rearranged the living room, pushing Mama's piano into the corner to make room for a big television set she'd bought on credit. She'd taken down the family photos from the mantelpiece and replaced them with ceramic figurines of horses and cowboys that she'd collected from gas stations. The worst part was how she talked to Daddy, like he was a child instead of a grown man who'd raised 4 children and built half the houses in our neighbourhood. "Tommy, honey, you forgot to take your heart pills again," she'd coo in that syrupy voice, shaking the bottle like a rattle. "What am I going to do with you?" Tommy. She called my father Tommy, like he was some boyfriend from high school, instead of Thomas James Kowalski, a man who'd earned respect through 40 years of hard work and honest living. Christmas of 1987 was the first holiday without Mama, and we'd all been dreading it. I'd planned a big dinner at our house, all of Daddy's children and grandchildren together, trying to make new traditions while honouring the old ones. I'd even gotten out Mama's good silver and her special Christmas tablecloth with the embroidered poinsettias. But Daddy called 2 days before Christmas. His voice sounded strange, formal, like he was reading from a script. "Maggie, honey, Charlie and I won't be able to make it for dinner. We're driving down to Kentucky to meet her family." Kentucky, to meet her family. While his own family, his 4 children and 8 grandchildren, sat around a Christmas table with an empty chair where he should have been. That was the beginning of the end of our family as we knew it. The changes started small, the way they always do. Little things that individually seemed harmless, but together formed a pattern that made my stomach clench with worry every time I thought about it. In January of 1988, Daddy stopped coming to Sunday dinners altogether. When I called to invite him, Charlie would answer the phone in that honey-sweet voice. "Oh, Margaret, honey, Tommy's just so tired on Sundays, all that construction work, you know. We usually just stay in and watch television." But Daddy wasn't working construction anymore. He'd retired the previous fall after his doctor told him his heart couldn't handle the physical labour. He should have been taking it easy, maybe doing some light carpentry in his garage workshop, spending time with his grandchildren. Instead, he was sitting in front of that big television set, watching whatever Charlie wanted to watch. When I did manage to see him, catching him at the hardware store or the post office, he looked different. Older somehow and smaller. The confident way he used to carry himself, shoulders back and head high, had been replaced by a shuffling walk and downcast eyes. He'd lost weight too, though Charlie kept bragging about what a good cook she was. By spring, the financial changes became obvious. Daddy had always been careful with money. Had to be, raising 4 kids on a construction worker's salary. But suddenly he was spending like he'd hit the lottery. New furniture appeared in the house on Elm Street. A brand new Buick replaced his trusty pickup truck. Charlie started wearing jewellery that sparkled in the sunlight and clothes from the expensive department stores downtown. "Where's all this money coming from?" I asked my brother Jim during one of our worried phone conversations. Jim was the oldest, 43 then, and had always been the one Daddy turned to for practical advice. "I drove by the house yesterday," Jim said, his voice tight with concern. "There's contractors working on the roof, and it looks like they're putting in new windows. That's got to be $15,000 easy." $15,000. In 1988, that was more than Frank made in 6 months at the plant. Where was Daddy getting that kind of money? The answer came in May, when I ran into Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store. Mrs. Henderson had been Mama and Daddy's neighbour for 23 years, and she had the worried look of someone carrying bad news. "Margaret, honey," she said, glancing around like she was afraid someone might overhear. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think you should know. Your father took out a mortgage on the house." A mortgage? On the house that had been paid off for 12 years. The house where Mama had planted her roses and hung her curtains and raised her children. The house that was supposed to be Daddy's security in his old age. "How do you know?" I asked, though my hands were already shaking as I gripped the shopping cart handle. My nephew works at First National Bank, Mrs. Henderson explained. He processed the paperwork. $30,000, Margaret. Your father borrowed $30,000 against that house. $30,000. In 1988, that was enough to buy a nice new car and still have money left over for a year's worth of groceries. What was he doing with $30,000? That evening, I called Daddy directly, bypassing Charlie for once because I'd timed it when she should be at work. But it was Charlie who answered, and her voice had lost all its sweetness. Margaret, I'm getting tired of you checking up on Tommy like he's some kind of invalid. He's a grown man who can make his own decisions. I want to talk to my father, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, he doesn't want to talk to you right now. He's tired of all this interference from his children. Maybe if you showed him a little respect and trust, he'd be more inclined to visit. The line went dead. My own father's girlfriend had hung up on me, and I had no way to reach him without going through her. That night, Frank and I sat at our kitchen table with cups of coffee that grew cold as we talked about what to do. Frank was a practical man, not given to dramatic gestures, but even he was worried. Tom's not thinking clearly, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee for the third time. This woman's got him wrapped around her finger, and he can't see what she's doing to him. But what can we do? I asked. He's a grown man. We can't force him to see what's happening. Frank was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the streetlights coming on in the gathering dusk. Finally, he spoke. We wait, and we document everything, because someday, when this all falls apart, he's going to need us to help him pick up the pieces. How right he was. Summer of 1988 brought more changes, each one more alarming than the last. Daddy and Charlie took a 2-week vacation to Las Vegas, staying at expensive hotels and gambling at casinos. Charlie came back with stories about shows and restaurants and shopping trips that made my head spin when I tried to calculate the cost. We had such a wonderful time, she gushed when I encountered them at the post office. Tommy is such a generous man. He bought me this beautiful ring at one of those fancy jewellery stores. She held out her hand to show me a diamond ring that caught the light and threw rainbows across the post office wall. Even to my untrained eye, it looked expensive, very expensive. That's lovely, I managed to say, while my mind calculated how much money Daddy could possibly have left after all these expenditures. The answer came in August, when I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Sandra Morrison, and at first I didn't recognise the name. "This is Sandra Morrison," the voice said. "Charlene Morrison's daughter. I think we need to talk." Sandra was 22 years old, living in Louisville with her baby daughter and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She'd driven all the way to Michigan because she was worried about what her mother was doing to my father. We met at a coffee shop downtown, a little place with red vinyl booths and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Sandra was a thin girl with her mother's blonde hair, but none of her hardness. She looked tired and worried, and she kept glancing toward the door like she was afraid someone might see us together. "My mother's done this before," Sandra said, stirring cream into her coffee with shaking hands. "She finds lonely older men and makes them feel special, and then she takes everything they have." She told me about Harold Brennan, a widower from Tennessee who'd owned a small trucking business. Charlie had been with him for 2 years, and when she left, the business was bankrupt and Harold was living in a trailer park. Before Harold, there was Robert Chen, who owned a restaurant in Nashville. Same story. She moved in, started spending his money, and when there wasn't any more to spend, she disappeared. "But this time feels different," Sandra continued. "She's been with your father longer than any of the others. I think she's planning something bigger." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Sandra reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She left this on her dresser at Christmas when I visited. I don't think she meant for me to see it, but it was a handwritten list in Charlie's distinctive script. At the top it said Tommy's assets, and underneath was an itemised list that made my blood run cold. House on Elm Street, estimated value $85,000. Savings account at First National, $12,000. CD at Credit Union, $8,000. Pension payout, FAM, $200 month. Social Security, $890 month. Life insurance policy, $50,000. At the bottom of the page, in red ink, someone had written, marriage and 50% minimum, will Farage 100%. Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. I think she's planning to marry him. The coffee shop seemed to disappear around me. The buzzing fluorescent lights, the clatter of dishes, the conversations at other tables, everything faded as the implications of that list hit me like a physical blow. Marriage would give Charlie legal claim to half of everything Daddy owned. A will could give her everything. When? I managed to ask. I don't know for sure, Sandra said. But she's been talking about how nice a Christmas wedding would be. She says the holidays are romantic. Christmas. 4 months away. 4 months to figure out how to save my father from financial ruin and emotional devastation. As Sandra and I parted ways in the parking lot, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Mrs. Kowalski, I love my mother, but I know what she is. Please don't let her destroy your father like she destroyed those other men. He seems like a good person, and he doesn't deserve this. That night I called an emergency family meeting. All 4 of Daddy's children gathered in my living room: Jim, myself, our sister Carol, and our youngest brother Mike. We spread Sandra's list on the coffee table and stared at it like it was a death warrant, which, in a way, it was. We have to do something, Carol said. Carol was 41, a nurse at the county hospital, and she had that practical way of looking at problems that came from years of dealing with medical crises. If she marries him and gets him to change his will, he'll have nothing left for his old age. What happens when he gets sick? What happens when he needs care? Mike, who was 35 and worked as an accountant, was already doing calculations on the back of an envelope. If she's spent $30,000 from the mortgage, plus whatever he's pulled out of savings for that car and the Vegas trip and all that jewellery, Jim, what do you think he's got left? Jim ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from when we were kids, and he was trying to solve some impossible problem. I'd guess maybe $40,000 in liquid assets plus the house, but if she gets him to take out a bigger mortgage or sell the house. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood. So what do we do? I asked. He won't listen to us. Every time one of us tries to talk to him, she interferes or makes him angry. It's like she's built a wall between him and his family. Frank, who'd been quiet through the whole meeting, finally spoke up. We need proof. Not suspicions, not worries, but actual proof of what she's doing. Something concrete that even Tom can't ignore. What kind of proof? Mike asked. Frank looked around the room at all of us, his wife and her siblings, united in our fear for the man who'd raised us and shaped us and loved us through all the years of our growing up. We need to find Harold Brennan and Robert Chen. We need to document what she did to them, and we need to do it before Christmas. That was the moment our real fight began. The Monday morning after our family meeting, I did something I'd never done in my 39 years of life. I called in sick to work. I was a secretary at the school district office then, and drove to the public library downtown. Now remember, this was 1988. There was no internet, no Google searches, no easy way to find information about people from other states. But our librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had been helping people track down information for 25 years, and she knew every resource available. I need to find 2 men, I told her, explaining the situation as delicately as I could. Harold Brennan from Tennessee, who used to own a trucking business, and Robert Chen, who owned a restaurant in Nashville. Patterson adjusted her reading glasses and led me to a section I'd never noticed before. Shelves lined with telephone directories from cities all across the country, business directories, and something called Polk's City Directory that listed residents by address. It took 3 hours of searching through Nashville phone books and business directories, but we found them. Harold Brennan was listed in a trailer park called Pine Valley Mobile Home Community. Robert Chen had an address on the south side of Nashville. From the library, I drove to the Western Union office and sent telegrams to both men, explaining who I was and asking if they'd be willing to talk to me about Charlene Morrison. I included my phone number and asked them to call collect if they were willing to help. Harold Brennan called that very evening. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that sounded 20 years older than his age, "if that woman is anywhere near your father, you need to get him away from her as fast as you can." Harold told me his story over the course of a 40-minute phone call that cost me nearly $30 in long-distance charges. He'd been a widower for 3 years when he met Charlie at a truck stop diner outside Nashville. She was working the night shift, and she made him feel like the most important customer who'd ever walked through the door. "She had this way of making you feel special," Harold explained. "Like you were the only man in the world who understood her, who could take care of her properly. After my wife died, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed." Within 6 months, Charlie had moved into Harold's house. Within a year, she'd convinced him to expand his trucking business, taking out loans against his equipment and his property. She said she had business experience, that she could help him grow the company into something bigger. "The money just disappeared," Harold said, his voice breaking. "New trucks, a fancy office, expensive equipment we didn't need. She said it was all investment, that we'd make it back double. But the contracts she promised never materialized, and the bills kept coming." When the business finally collapsed, Harold lost everything: his trucks, his building, even his house. Charlie disappeared the day the bankruptcy papers were filed, taking his pickup truck and the $3,000 he'd kept in a coffee can for emergencies. "I'm 68 years old," Harold told me, "and I'm living in a trailer park, working part-time at a gas station just to afford my heart medication. That woman destroyed 30 years of honest work in less than 2 years." Robert Chen's story was eerily similar. I reached him 2 days later, and he told me about how Charlie had convinced him to renovate his restaurant, to expand into catering, to buy expensive equipment for a banquet hall that never opened. She'd handled the books, she'd made the decisions, and when it was all over, the Golden Dragon restaurant was closed, and Robert was working as a cook in someone else's kitchen. "She took everything," Robert said simply. "My restaurant, my savings, my pride. When she left, I found out she'd been forging my signature on loan documents, but by then it was too late. The lawyers said it would cost more to fight it than I could ever recover." Both men agreed to write statements about their experiences with Charlie Morrison. Harold drove all the way to Michigan to meet with us in person, arriving on a Saturday morning in September in an old Chevy that sounded like it might not make the return trip. He was a thin man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly when he talked about Charlie, but his memory for details was sharp, and he spent 3 hours with Mike, who'd brought his portable typewriter, dictating a detailed account of every financial transaction, every forged signature, every lie Charlie had told. "Why are you helping us?" I asked Harold as we walked him to his car. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the house where I'd grown up, the same house where Daddy was probably sitting with Charlie, planning their Christmas wedding. "Because maybe if I can help save your father," he said finally, "it'll mean something good came out of what happened to me." That's when I knew we were doing the right thing. Armed with written statements from both Harold and Robert, plus documentation of Charlie's pattern of financial fraud, we decided it was time to confront Daddy. But we knew we'd only get one chance. If Charlie was there, she'd find a way to discredit everything we said or manipulate Daddy into dismissing our concerns. Jim came up with the plan. He called Daddy on a Tuesday morning in October and told him there was a problem with the deed to the house. Something about the property lines that needed to be resolved before any major renovations could be completed. Could Daddy meet him at the county courthouse at 2 p.m. to look at the records? It was a lie, but it was a lie told in service of the truth. Daddy arrived at the courthouse exactly on time, dressed in his good pants and the new leather jacket. He looked puzzled when he saw all 4 of his children waiting for him on the steps. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice already defensive. "Jim said something about the property deed." "Daddy," I said, taking his arm gently, "we need to talk to you about Charlie. Please, just give us 30 minutes. If you still want to walk away after that, we won't bother you again." We'd reserved a small conference room in the courthouse basement, the kind lawyers use to meet with clients before hearings. It was a sterile place with fluorescent lighting and metal furniture, but it was private and it was away from Charlie's influence. Daddy sat across from us, his arms crossed, his jaw set in the stubborn expression we all remembered from childhood. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, "but Charlie's not going to like me being gone this long." "That's part of the problem, Dad," Jim said quietly. "When's the last time you made a decision without worrying about what Charlie would think?" We started with Harold's statement. Mike read it aloud, every detail about the trucking business, the forged signatures, the financial manipulation, the sudden disappearance when the money ran out. Daddy's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair. Then we read Robert Chen's statement. The restaurant, the equipment loans, the expansion that never happened, the bankruptcy, the pattern of lies and false promises. "2 men, Daddy," Carol said softly. 2 different cities, 2 different businesses, but exactly the same pattern, and now she's doing the same thing to you. Finally, I pulled out Sandra's list, the itemized accounting of Daddy's assets with the notation about marriage and wills. I placed it on the table in front of him, smoothing out the creases where I'd folded and unfolded it so many times. Daddy stared at the list for a long time without speaking. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, anger, and something that looked like heartbreak. "Where did you get this?" he asked finally. "From someone who loves you enough to want to protect you," I said. "Someone who's seen this happen before and doesn't want to see it happen again." When Daddy finally looked up, his eyes were wet with tears. "She said she loved me," he whispered. "She said I made her feel safe and protected. She said we could build a life together." "Maybe she does love you in her own way," Jim said gently. "But look at the evidence, Dad. Look at what happened to Harold and Robert. Look at your own bank statements. How much money have you spent since she moved in?" Daddy was quiet for a long time, staring at that list. Finally he spoke, his voice so low we had to lean forward to hear him. $43,000, he said. "The mortgage, the car, the Vegas trip, the jewelry, the house improvements. $43,000 in 8 months. "And how much do you have left?" Mike asked, though we all knew the answer would be painful. "Maybe 8,000 in savings. The CDs are gone. We cashed them out to pay for the kitchen renovation. The pension and Social Security are about all that's coming in now." Carol reached across the table and took Daddy's hand. "It's not too late," she said. "You can still get out of this before you lose everything." "But what if you're wrong?" Daddy asked, and for a moment he sounded like a lost child instead of our strong, capable father. "What if she really does love me? What if this is just coincidence?" That's when I pulled out our final piece of evidence. The week before our courthouse meeting, Frank had done something that still amazes me when I think about it. He'd taken a day off work and driven to Kentucky to visit Sandra Morrison in person. Sandra had been more than willing to help, especially after she'd received a tearful phone call from her mother about how wonderful the upcoming wedding was going to be and how generous Tommy was being with the arrangements. Frank had convinced Sandra to search through her mother's belongings when Charlie wasn't home. What she found was a cardboard box hidden in the back of a closet, filled with documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud going back more than 10 years. There were photographs of Charlie with different men, Harold, Robert, and 3 others we hadn't even known about. There were copies of marriage certificates. She'd been married to Harold for exactly 4 months before disappearing with his assets. There were forged signatures on loan documents, fake business correspondence, and detailed notes about each man's financial situation. But the most damning evidence was a letter Charlie had written to someone named Diana, apparently another woman involved in similar schemes. The letter was dated just 2 weeks earlier, and it detailed her plans for Daddy with clinical precision. Frank pulled the letter from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. I read it aloud, my voice shaking with anger. "Diana, the Michigan job is almost finished. Tommy is exactly as lonely and desperate as we thought. He'll do anything to keep me happy. The wedding is set for December 23rd, and I've already got him thinking about updating his will as a Christmas present to me. After the holidays, I'll convince him to sell the house and move somewhere warmer, maybe Florida or Arizona. Once we're away from his family and friends, it'll be easy to liquidate everything. I should be ready for a new location by spring." The letter went on to describe Daddy as pathetically grateful for any attention and detailed specific plans for isolating him from his family and draining his remaining assets. When I finished reading, Daddy was crying. Not the quiet tears from earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. All of his children reached for him at once, surrounding him with the kind of love and protection we should have been giving him all along. "I'm such a fool," he kept saying. "I'm such an old fool." "No, Daddy," I said, holding him tight. "You're a man who was grieving and lonely, and she took advantage of that. This isn't your fault." But now came the hard part, figuring out how to get Charlie out of his life without losing whatever assets he had left. Mike, with his accounting background, laid out our strategy. First, we needed to secure whatever money Daddy had left. Second, we needed to document everything Charlie had taken. Third, we needed to get her out of the house and out of Daddy's life without giving her a chance to do more damage. "The most important thing," Mike explained, "is that she can't know we're onto her until we're ready to act. If she suspects anything, she might try to rush the wedding or convince Dad to sign over more assets." The next morning, Daddy went to First National Bank and opened a new savings account under just his name. He transferred the remaining $8,000 from their joint account, along with his pension and Social Security deposits. Then he went to his lawyer, the same man who'd handled Mama's will, and made sure his existing will was secure and couldn't be changed without proper legal procedures. The hardest part was going home and acting normal. Daddy had to pretend nothing had changed, had to continue planning the Christmas wedding, had to smile and nod when Charlie talked about their future together. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," he told me later. "Every time she touched me or said she loved me, I wanted to scream, but I knew if I confronted her too soon, she'd find a way to take whatever was left." Meanwhile, we were gathering more evidence. Frank contacted a lawyer who specialized in fraud cases, and he helped us document everything properly. We photographed the forged signatures, we recorded the financial transactions, we prepared a case that would hold up in court if necessary. The confrontation came 3 weeks before the planned wedding, on a cold December afternoon when snow was falling outside the windows of the house on Elm Street. Daddy had told Charlie he was going Christmas shopping, but instead he'd gone to the police station to file a formal complaint about the forged signatures and financial fraud. When he returned home, all 4 of his children were waiting in the living room with boxes of evidence spread across Mama's coffee table. Charlie walked in from the kitchen, carrying a cup of coffee and talking about wedding flowers, and stopped dead when she saw us all there. "What's going on?" she asked, but her voice had already changed. The honey-sweet tone was gone, replaced by something sharp and calculating. Daddy looked at her for a long moment, and I could see him gathering strength from somewhere deep inside himself. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "I know about Harold and Robert and the others. I know about your plans for me." Charlie's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and then a kind of cold fury I'd never seen before. "I don't know what you think you know," she said, "but you're making a big mistake." "Am I?" Daddy asked. He picked up the letter she'd written to Diana and held it out to her. "Is this a mistake too?" For a moment I thought Charlie might try to deny everything, might continue the charade of being the loving girlfriend who just wanted to make Daddy happy. But instead her whole demeanour changed. The act dropped away, and we saw who she really was underneath. "You stupid old man," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think any woman would actually love you? Look at yourself. You're old, you're boring, you smell like motor oil, and you tell the same stories over and over. I gave you 8 months of attention you never deserved, and you think that's worth complaining about?" "You took $43,000 from him," Jim said, standing up from his chair. "You destroyed his savings, you mortgaged his house, you isolated him from his family." Charlie laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I earned every penny putting up with his pathetic gratitude. Do you know what it's like pretending to care about some old man's aches and pains, listening to him talk about his dead wife like she was some kind of saint?" That's when Carol stood up, her nurse's training taking over. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "Right now. Take your things and get out." "Oh, I'm leaving," Charlie said, her voice rising. "But I'm taking what's mine. That ring he bought me, those clothes, the car." "The car is in Dad's name," Mike said, consulting his legal documents. "The ring was purchased with money obtained through fraud." "You're not taking anything." What happened next was the most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal. Charlie stormed toward the bedroom to pack her things, but Frank was blocking the doorway. Behind him we could see 2 police officers. Daddy had called them before we'd started the confrontation. "Ma'am," one of the officers said politely, "we need to talk to you about some financial irregularities. You have the right to remain silent." Charlie was arrested that afternoon on charges of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The legal proceedings took months, but eventually she was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, with an order to make restitution to her victims. But the real transformation wasn't in Charlie's fate, it was in what happened to our family afterward. Daddy moved out of the house on Elm Street. Too many bad memories, he said, too many reminders of his mistakes. He sold it and used the money to pay off the mortgage and cover some of his losses. Then he bought a small apartment near our neighbourhood, close enough that he could walk to Sunday dinner. It took time for him to heal from the emotional damage Charlie had done. He'd trusted someone completely, given them his heart and his hope for the future, and been betrayed in the most calculating way possible. That kind of wound doesn't heal quickly. But slowly, gradually, Daddy began to find himself again. He started coming to Sunday dinners regularly, bringing those peppermint candies for the grandchildren and telling his construction stories with something approaching his old enthusiasm. He joined a senior centre and made new friends, real friends who valued him for who he was, not what he owned. He also became something of a crusader against elder fraud. He spoke at community centres and church groups, telling his story and warning other seniors about the signs of financial manipulation. He helped 3 other families expose similar schemes, and he testified at several trials. "Maybe some good can come out of what happened to me," he told me one Sunday over pot roast. "Maybe I can help other people avoid the same mistakes." Daddy lived for another 15 years after the Charlie Morrison disaster, and they were good years. Maybe the best years of his life since Mama passed. He travelled with senior groups, took up photography, learned to use a computer, and stayed actively involved in his grandchildren's lives. He never remarried, though he had several lady friends over the years, women who knew his story and appreciated his hard-won wisdom about relationships and trust. He was careful, but he wasn't closed off. He'd learned the difference between healthy caution and paralysing fear. When Daddy passed away in 2003 at the age of 78, he left behind a modest but secure estate that was divided equally among his 4 children, just as he'd always planned. More importantly, he left behind the knowledge that he'd overcome his mistakes and spent his final years surrounded by people who truly loved him. At his funeral, Harold Brennan drove up from Tennessee to pay his respects. He was in his 80s by then, but he'd rebuilt a small life for himself, and he credited Daddy's courage in exposing Charlie with helping him find the strength to start over. "Your father saved my life," Harold told me at the graveside service. Not because of what he did to that woman, but because he showed me it was possible to survive being fooled by someone you trust. He showed me that making a mistake doesn't mean your life is over. Now, at 73, I think about Daddy's story often. Not because I'm worried about being victimized, though elder fraud is more common now than ever, but because I understand something he taught me through his experience. We all make mistakes. We all trust the wrong people sometimes. We all let loneliness or grief cloud our judgment. But we don't have to let those mistakes define the rest of our lives. Daddy could have spent his final 15 years consumed by shame and regret. Instead, he chose to use his experience to help others and to rebuild relationships with the people who actually loved him. He chose healing over bitterness, wisdom over self-pity. That's the real ending to this story. Not that justice was served or that the bad person got punished, but that a good man found his way back to himself and to his family. That's the victory that matters. If you're dealing with family conflicts, financial manipulation, or the aftermath of betrayal, remember Daddy's example. It's never too late to choose healing. It's never too late to rebuild trust with the people who actually love you. And it's never too late to use your experience to help others avoid the same pitfalls. That's my story, and that's my father's legacy. Thank you for listening, and remember, family isn't perfect, but family is forever. Sometimes we have to fight for each other, and sometimes we have to forgive each other, but we never stop loving each other. If this story helped you in any way, please subscribe and share it with someone who